Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the Fat Burning Man Show, where we talk about real food and real results. Have you ever tried measuring your blood glucose? There's never been a better time to use cutting-edge technology to quantify and optimize your health. But instead of jumping straight into invasive dystopian technology like brain implants to turn us straight into the Borg, we can use tech as a tool to improve our habits. It doesn't have to be overly complicated, and it's quickly becoming easier and cheaper to track heart rate variability, sleep quality, fitness, blood sugar, and much more. But what's most important is how we use our data to modify our daily practices. So joining us on the show today is Kara Collier, a registered dietitian nutritionist, certified nutrition support clinician, and the director of nutrition at NutriSense, where she's also a leading authority on the use of continuous glucose monitoring, or CGM, technology. But before we get there, here's a note and a question that came in from Stacy, who's been crushing it in the Wild Challenge. She says, "Hi, Abel. I feel good. I am down 17 pounds in just 45 days. So awesome. More importantly, my clothes fit better and I just feel so much better. I've been following you for quite a few years and really enjoy your podcast as well. I have a quick question when you have a sec. I do intermittent fasting just about every day, as I'm just not hungry in the morning. I really restrict carbs, not veggies though, and sometimes I just feel either really tired or really hungry. I often skip my weekly cheat meal too. I often think about a sweet potato with butter, LOL. Any thoughts?" Okay, Stacy, I'm thrilled with your results. Thanks so much for writing in, and that is an excellent question. I actually get it quite a lot. So with intermittent fasting and carb restriction, certainly calorie restriction, sometimes those things go together. If you follow that road too far, if you do those things too hard or too long, then you can run out of gas. And sometimes hormones can downregulate. I know if I go too long, too low carb, I experience a lot of the same feelings, like my hunger isn't in check. I don't have the energy that I otherwise would. And so there's nothing wrong with a sweet potato refeed. And keep in mind, we'll discuss on this show that certain carbs and starches and sugars affect people completely differently. So Cara on this show, sweet potatoes set her blood glucose straight to the moon, whereas I've done some experiments and sweet potatoes seem fine for me, at least so far. So experiment with different carbs. Don't be afraid of getting in a nice balance of macros, especially on a cyclical basis. I like doing carb refeeds post-workout. That's when you're going to be in the best state to accept those carbs and sugars into your muscle and liver glycogen stores. So there are ways to go about this where you can eat your carbs and still maintain a great lifestyle and also body composition. Don't be afraid of carbs. I know that keto has been the craze for the past few years, but it's not necessarily the answer, not for everyone. One quick little tip, if you'd like to reduce the glycemic load of your starches when you're eating them, make sure to do the low temperature methods, more like the steaming, boiling, as opposed to frying and baking, the high temperature methods. That's going to have a more favorable effect on your system from a blood sugar point of view. We'll dig in a lot more on this show, but anyway, thank you for the question. And if you folks are out there, you'd like to join us in our next Wild Challenge, we have many giveaways coming up. We've given away some huggable bacon plushies, and you can get the next one. They're absolutely adorable, and Allison does a great job putting together these prize packages. So make sure to get in on the next challenge. You can go to fatburningman.com/app. That's fatburningman.com/app. And you can use the code WILD25 to join our next challenge for 25% off. You'll get done for you meal plans, daily guidance in the palm of your hand, and we'll even enter you into our next giveaway for a chance to win huggable bacon plushies, superfood supplements from our very own Wild Superfoods, and signed copies of the Wild Diet. Here's one last quick note that came in from Nikki, who recently completed her first Wild Challenge. Congrats, Nikki. She says, "I feel fantastic. I look slimmer, still a ways to go to get to a healthy, leaner self. I feel slimmer, my skin looks healthy, my energy and mood are great. I feel and look healthier than I have in years. Enough so that people around me have noticed a change and comment on it. Being able to bend over and not feel like my gut is bloated and in the way is amazing. I plan to continue on this track. Thanks for the help, Nikki. Thank you so much for getting in touch, Nikki, and all of you who have joined in our wild challenges and our various communities. We're really trying to make our whole business based around community and interacting with you. So I would love for you to join in our next wild challenge. Get in touch. There's a lot of interactivity built into our app. You can even link it up with the fitness trackers. So if you'd like to get in the fun one more time, you can go to fatburningman.com/app. And don't forget to use the coupon code WILD25 to save 25% off. I'll see you there. All right, on to the show with Kara Collier. We're chatting about how to use technology as a tool to quantify and optimize your health, the benefits of tracking blood sugar with a continuous glucose monitor. I've got one in my arm right now. Why you're stealing energy from the next day when you have that ice cream or extra booze late at night. Why drinking oat milk is almost as bad as sugar-laden soda once it hits your bloodstream. Why it's a good idea to test your blood glucose after eating manufactured keto products, and tons more. Let's go hang out with Cara. Welcome back, folks. Today we're here with Kara Collier, a registered dietitian, certified nutrition support clinician, and the director of nutrition over at NutriSense. Cara is a leading authority on the use of continuous glucose monitoring, also known as CGM technology, particularly in non-diabetics for the purposes of health optimization, disease prevention, and reversing metabolic dysfunction. Cara oversees the health team and product development and has personally interpreted thousands of complex glucose data sets. Thanks so much for being here today.
Hey, Abel, thanks for having me.
Right on. Cara, it's been a while since I started experimenting with this, thanks to you and some other folks who are dabbling in CGMs. And I've just been fascinated and impressed by how, for something that used to be such an invasive, expensive technology, now it really does seem like it's getting super close. Maybe we're already here, where we can get super valuable data for people who don't have a lot of money or people who aren't very tech obsessed or don't want to get implants. They can also get results by using devices that are becoming more and more accessible. So maybe you can just start out by explaining a little bit of your background and what CGM technology is.
Yeah, so starting a little bit about myself with my background, I am a registered dietitian, as you mentioned, and I started my career kind of in the traditional healthcare system. So mostly working in hospitals, mostly ICUs, dealing with very sick patients. And that experience was very eye-opening, but also very frustrating for me. So I was seeing a lot of people coming in with a ton of pain and suffering and time and financial constraints because of complications of lifestyle-related chronic conditions. So, needing a leg amputation because of uncontrolled diabetes, needing to go on kidney dialysis because of fluid overload and hypertension, all of these things that at the end of the day, you realize could have been preventable if you had the right tools, the right motivation, the right information way, way earlier on. So from that experience, I really became obsessed with trying to address some of those root causes and trying to figure out a solution that could help prevent people from getting there in the first place. And a lot of this pointed towards glucose and metabolic health as really a root cause for a lot of these problems. And then that brought me to the continuous glucose monitoring, CGM technology. So CGMs, we can talk about the history of the technology. As you mentioned, it's come a long way in a short amount of time. So we can only imagine how it's going to change in just a short few years in front of us. But this is a small device that you can put on the back of your arm, and then suddenly you can see 24/7 glucose data from your own body. So it's one of these unique pieces of technology where you actually get a window into what's happening on the inside. So not just the scale, not just how you feel, but also you can see the mechanics of how your choices day to day are affecting your body. So for me, this was this powerful metric that actually had something meaningful, but was also motivating to people because it's personalized and it's in real time, and that could help address some of that root cause I was seeing day to day at the hospitals.
And there are surprises, even for, me, I've been doing this show and obsessed with health for more than a decade. And there were so many surprises once I started seeing how my body reacted to exercise, differences in insulin sensitivity based on sleep, and then, of course, how your body or my body might react differently to the same foods. It's just startling. And it's right there. It's hard to ignore when you see the data. So you went from kind of seeing the results of following the herd, the standard American diet, and what that manifests into at the extreme level, working in the Western medicine system. People who are on the other side of that, the self-improvement side, the people who are wearing CGMs for health optimization reasons, they're put in, they're called biohackers, or they're called this crazy, wacky thing. I think we should really try to normalize this other side of people who are working hard on preventative health, such that they don't, wind up with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt at the end of their lives, dying too early as the result of these crazy diseases that manifest from just eating normal-looking foods.
Yeah, absolutely agree. They're dubbed as weird or crazy for caring about their health, but these are people who are just being responsible and being advocates for their own wellness and well-being. And that's exactly what should be the norm. And that would be what would be best for everybody in the long term. I have a short story about myself personally where I was moving around and I saw a new primary care physician, and I'm very meticulous about getting certain labs every year and tracking them, even though I'm healthy and I don't have any problems. And so I asked for these labs that I've always received, and she was like, "Oh, you don't need those. You're young and you're healthy. You actually don't need any labs probably for another decade." And I was like, well, actually, I don't think that that's what you should be promoting. And it was this whole thing. But, that's unfortunately the mindset in traditional healthcare systems. Not that I'm poo-pooing on MDs or physicians, they do a great job, but it's how we're taught is to think about arriving with symptoms and treating those symptoms, not thinking ahead and preventing and caring about optimization, which is what we're trying to do at NutriSense, is change that focus and help these people who are being pushed away by the traditional healthcare system because they're trying to be proactive rather than reactive, and give them the information that they want. So these CGM devices are considered medical devices in the US, and so they require medical prescription. Mm-hmm. And so for a lot of people, the biohackers who just want this information about their bodies, they might go to their physician and ask for it because they need a prescription, and 99% of the time they're not going to write them that script because they're not diabetic, or they don't have a specific reason for it. So we're taking care of all that for people. We have physicians who will write these prescriptions for people as a preventative use case, because it's just unfortunately not the norm.
Or not the norm yet. Anyway.
Yes, yeah.
But
exactly
as the technology advances and the devices become more accessible and inexpensive, hopefully that will change for this technology and other ones. I'm not a fan of brain implants and the invasive kind of dystopian technologies, but I think something like this, I'm wearing one in my arm right now, is it's not something that is terribly inconvenient or is a huge invasion of your privacy. It's more, basically what happens is you can see the direct result on your blood sugar after you eat something, or after you exercise, or you don't exercise, and all these other things. And some of the most valuable information, I think you offered an example on, maybe it was the blog about bananas versus, I think it was starchy carbs, right? Like below ground tubers, sweet potatoes and things like that. And the effects that has on your personal blood sugar. Maybe I'll let you share that, because it is surprising.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm in the same boat as you, is where I've been researching this stuff for a long time. I thought I had a pretty good idea of how I was going to respond. I wasn't expecting a bunch of surprises. And the first time I wore CGM, for several times, I was shocked by how much information was new to me and that I wouldn't have been able to capture otherwise. So with the fruit, what I was doing was I was testing all different types of fruit. So in a very controlled setting, in the morning when I was fasted, I would eat a same portion size of fruit to see how I was responding to different things. And I tried probably 20 different fruits, and banana is consistently my lowest glucose response, which to me was just hilarious because it's considered a starchy vegetable, higher glycemic index.
Yeah.
And all my life, I was like, oh, I shouldn't eat bananas. I should choose this or that instead. But that's just not how my body personally responds. And now that we've seen so many people's glucose data, I can say this is true for just about everyone. Everybody has some sort of surprise that doesn't match up with the expectation or the norm. We use glycemic index as a proxy for how you might respond, how high your glucose will go after eating a food. And that's an average, that's a population average. So on average, you probably will have a higher response to bananas, but you as an individual might be an outlier to that. And that's what we see all the time is the average doesn't mean that's what is going to be best for you.
Right. And for you, I think sweet potatoes set it off way more than bananas. And so as an experiment last night, we had sweet potato fries, which weren't even boiled first. They were more the baked variety, I think, with coconut oil. They're delicious, but and they were the purple variety of sweet potatoes, which might matter. I'll have to try the other kinds. I think that's the responsible and fun thing to do if you geek out on it like I do. But they didn't seem to set me off in any particular way. In fact, my blood glucose was way less after I ate a considerable amount of those sweet potatoes and even a little bit of dried fruit. It was less than the day before after I did deadlifts, fasted, which is just crazy to me that my blood sugar will be higher during my workouts completely fasted, just running on liver glycogen and muscle glycogen and all of that. The body, essentially operating like it should. But the idea to me that it would go higher there, fasted workouts, than it would from eating something that was supposed to make it go crazy, like a baked sweet potato, especially in fry form. Or for me, who knows, maybe a banana will set it off.
Yeah, and that's just the fascinating part about collecting this data is you really realize that the no one size fits all approach is the best approach. We've been trying to push very rigid nutrition advice to people. And then you realize that might not be the best approach. We really have to take a personalized approach. And then the comment about exercise is really interesting because many people see that higher intensity exercise. So if you're doing HIIT training or heavy deadlifts, heavy squats, heavy resistance training, you probably will see a rather large glucose spike, even if you're fasted. And people are always like, is that bad? What's going on? And it's not a bad thing. It's not the same thing as a glucose spike from food because your body is essentially saying, I don't have the immediate energy available to fuel this intensity of exercise. So I'm going to create it. Like you said, we have these glycogen stores, going to break down our stores of glucose, fuel the workout so that you have the energy to power through. So it's immediately going to use as opposed to if you eat a food, have a spike, might not be going to use necessarily. And this is actually a great thing. Many people are a little concerned when they see that exercise spike, but it's showing you that your body has different mechanisms in place to handle it. We don't necessarily need a pre-workout snack because your body can fuel that exercise. Everything differs depending on the person and their level of fitness. But I think it's a really good example of how our bodies are pretty smart and they've figured out a lot of these things. We don't necessarily have to feed it 24/7 to survive.
Yeah, and even the adaptations I've read about for long-term low carbers, where they'll get a higher baseline of glucose a lot of the time because the body's just like, oh, let's bump it up here because this is what you're doing. This is your new thing. What's your take on that? Because I found that fascinating as well.
Yeah, and this is something we see a lot. And so it wasn't something that was talked about too much when we were first getting started, but we would see it over and over. And essentially, it's an adaptation, just like you said. So people call it different things. Some people call it physiological insulin resistance. Some people call it adaptive glucose sparing. But essentially, what's happening is that over time, if you're on a very low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet, you might see a rise in your fasting glucose levels and your average glucose, but you won't be seeing spikes in glucose, of course, because you're not consuming carbohydrates. And essentially what's happening is the body is adaptable. It realizes you're not really giving me any glucose from the outside, you're not giving me carbohydrates from food. So I'm going to raise my production of glucose endogenously from the liver to make sure there's enough glucose available for glucose sensitive organs like the brain and other organs. And essentially the muscles, your skeletal muscles, which are normally the biggest sink for glucose, typically really utilizing glucose values, they start to favor fat as a fuel instead. And so they're not picking up that glucose as much, which means there's more in circulation and more available for other parts of the body. So it's a normal adaptation. And we usually see this, it depends on the person, but if you've been kind of strict, really low carbohydrate for at least a year, we start to see this adaptation happen. So then, of course, naturally, everyone's next question is, okay, that makes sense. Is this a bad thing or is this okay? And that is where, to be completely frank, we don't have actual research or evidence to say this is totally fine or this is bad. But in my mind, it just makes sense that it is a natural adaptation. And we can see this reverse pretty quickly. There is research on people who are very low carbohydrate and then they fail their gestational oral glucose tolerance test. So at 20 weeks, anyone who's been pregnant knows you have to drink a bunch of glucose to make sure you're not gestational diabetic. And a lot of these people who are low carb, because their body's not used to using glucose, will have this huge glucose response and they might be labeled falsely a diabetic. But if you eat carbs again, reintroduce your system to utilizing glucose, carbs as a fuel source for about 3 days beforehand, this effect goes away and you have a normal oral glucose tolerance test result. So to me, and we've seen that with people using the CGM, if they see this, they carb up for a couple days and they see those baseline values go back down a little bit. So it's reversible. It's not the same as pathological insulin resistance where you're on the road to diabetes and it's not reversible in 3 days. Trust me, it takes much longer than 3 days. It can be reversible, but it's two different types of physiology. So as long as you're okay with sticking to a pretty strict low carbohydrate diet, I think that's fine. I don't see any potential downside there as long as your fasting glucose isn't 120. If it's 105, 110, that's probably okay. But if it's getting really high, we might want to do something about it. But where you might want to consider being more metabolically flexible to both carbs and fat as a fuel source is if you want to have carbs occasionally. Like if every single weekend you're going out and having a big carb meal and your glucose spikes to 300 because your system's not used to using it, we might want to figure out some ways to be a little bit more metabolically flexible and maybe include a little small amount of carbohydrates more frequently so we can train the system that it knows, some carbs are coming in, I'm used to using that as a fuel source. So I really think it depends on your outlook. Like some people are like, I love being keto. I don't plan on ever eating carbs again, except for maybe once a year at Thanksgiving, not a big deal. Then that's totally fine. If that's working for you, I think do it and it's okay. But if you want to kind of cycle in and out more often, we might want to work on addressing that physiological insulin resistance a little bit.
Yeah, and you might be, once again, surprised by the results of eating those different foods that are supposed to be the worst offenders in terms of glycemic load or index, but in fact aren't, based on circumstance or your own biochemical individuality and all sorts of other factors. But we're also talking about, generally speaking, a tiny amount of sugar, like a teaspoon, right? And so even the amounts, like the baseline that it's going up for these long-time low-carbers with that adaptation, it kind of makes sense to me a little bit that you would want that higher baseline to avoid hypoglycemia if the body knows that it's just not getting that outside source, which would happen on a seasonal basis to most humans, historically speaking, I would imagine.
Exactly. And it is a tiny amount, it's about a teaspoon in your whole bloodstream. And so the body is amazing and it's really, really great at fine-tuning things. And so that slight increase, like you're saying, is not that much at the end of the day. And it is just a new baseline to adjust to the circumstances. So I agree. I'm really not that concerned about it as long as you're sticking to what you're sticking to. And at the end of the day, it really depends on what the person wants to do long term.
Yeah. Another surprise I had was what happened on my rest day when I ate the same foods that maybe were a little bit more starchy or sugary as I ate on my workout days, with a completely different effect. The day where I was a couch potato and I ate the starches and sugars, my blood sugar went, no, I don't want to say crazy, but the spike was significantly different and more pronounced than it was on my post-workout, where I don't usually even get a spike. It's like my muscles are so primed to just suck up all of that sugar that oftentimes I don't see it on the graph. Whereas if I don't have that effect on my, essentially if I haven't worked out, my body's in a completely different state and reacts a different way to food. And I think that's valuable information that definitely changes my habits on the non-workout days.
Yeah, it's a powerful tool. Exercise is one of the most amazing tools we have to increase our insulin sensitivity. So any type of exercise, especially strength training, but really any type, is going to help have a lower glucose response to food and increase your insulin sensitivity really for the rest of the day. And a lot of people do realize this. They try the CGM and they think they're going to have to restrict eating more, but they actually end up being able to sometimes liberalize their diet because they realize, oh, I can have that starchy food as long as it's after my workout. And now they know, like, it's okay if I have this, but I need to time it appropriately. And if I don't work out, then I need to swap something else. And you can build a plan that's sustainable and a little bit more flexible, but actually makes sense for your physiology. And I have the same thing. I typically work out fasted in the morning, and then I have my biggest carb meal, really my only carb meal after that. And same thing, my glucose barely budges because I just used a bunch of energy and my body's primed to take in carbohydrates. But if I skip my workout in the morning and I have that same first meal, it's a huge glucose response, same exact situation as you. So now I know, if I miss it or I have to go later in the day, it's going to be a totally different first meal. I need to swap things around. And that's an easy change. And it's more motivating to actually stick to that change because you saw the data yourself. It's real data, not just like vague advice from somewhere.
Yeah, and that's part of recovery too. A lot of people forget about the refeeding part of recovery, but that is so important. I remember when I was running marathons, the first few I didn't eat enough, especially afterwards, and I got sick and I just got so run down. And then, I kind of learned my lesson, and the times after I ate half a pie and I was fine. I was better off for it. It was really crazy to me. And I experienced the same thing once again wearing the CGM with way less exercise. I'm only running, 5 to 10 miles, generally speaking, these days. But once again, same thing. I think off the top of my head, I came back from like a 7-mile run doing hills, and it is intense at 8,000 feet or whatever. But after I got back, I had a full thing of coconut water with pulp, like 50 grams of sugar straight up, maybe a little more than that. I think 2 slices of bread, some dried fruit, and a couple of other things that were quite carby. And my glucose was like, you're fine, dude. That was like, keep going if you want to. I did. I ate a big meal, and for the rest of the day, it was totally cool. But once again, those days when I didn't have that effect on my insulin sensitivity, it was pronounced, even from eating a small amount of carby or sugary food. And I think, a lot of people say, including myself, that nutrition matters more than exercise if you have to put them next to each other. But it's so much more complicated than that, because you can have a lot more fun with nutrition if you do a little bit of exercise with partitioning, and you just can't have as much fun if you don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I agree that nutrition, I think, is more important at the end of the day. You cannot get away from a bad diet, no matter what you're doing. If you're exercising like crazy, it's going to catch up to you.
Right.
But that doesn't mean like exercise isn't important. And it's such a useful tool if you want some flexibility in your life. Like, some people will come to me and they'll say, I know I have an event coming up. It's my birthday, it's Christmas. Like, I'm gonna eat things I don't normally eat. What's the best way to like mitigate some of that damage? It's like, make sure you work out that morning before you go and do that thing. That's easy. That's an easy hack that's healthier for that day, and it's going to make a big difference. And a lot of people also will ask me, what macros should I add? What should I be eating? What are the exact amount of macronutrients I should have? And again, it's personalized. There's no one size fits all. But when it comes to carbohydrates, I always say titrate your carbohydrate intake to your level of physical activity. You can have more carbohydrates in your diet if you're pretty physically active and you're utilizing that energy. But if you know yourself and you're really not doing any workout right now and you're just trying to maybe boost some walking, some gentle movement, we're really going to have to pull back on those carbohydrates because you're not going to be able to process them as well or utilize that immediate quick energy. So really, I think carbohydrates and exercise level should be something that go hand in hand rather than the kind of generic recommendations of majority of your calories from carbohydrates, which might not even work. So 65% of your calories from carbohydrates that are the general recommendations might not even work for an athlete. But most of the time we have to titrate down depending on where you're at from a physical activity level.
And it just shows that most health advice, nutrition advice, medical advice is completely missing like some of the most important variables or aspects or circumstances, however you want to describe it, of health and of, your blood sugar, which glycemic index used to be a shorthand. Now we have a better way to kind of like get at that. And I think that's one of probably the most important thing that you could measure from a diet and nutrition standpoint, as you well know. And I'm psyched that it is getting more accessible because it will help people realize that this advice that's coming from all these health authorities is not and shouldn't be one size fits all in terms of effectiveness anyway. For some people, it will completely backfire, and we're all definitely individuals, and even on different days, you're a different person on your rest day or your non-workout day from the days that you're working out. And it's so important that people realize that. It's not about just like getting 60% of your calories from here and walking on Tuesdays. It's trickier than that. You have to be more strategic.
It is trickier. And like you're mentioning, sleep and stress also play a huge role. We always talk about how there are 4 key pillars to glucose management, and it's diet, exercise, stress, and sleep. So they're just as important if you want to have a well-balanced glucose levels. So, sleep, as you mentioned, if you have a poor night of sleep, your glucose levels are guaranteed going to be higher the next day. Mm-hmm. So let's say you have the all out meal on a day after you've exercised, you're well rested, it might be pretty minimal response. But then on the day where you had a bad night of sleep the night before, going to be much, much higher. And sleep and glucose actually go both ways. So going into the night with higher glucose values and you might not get as high of quality of sleep, but also having a poor night of sleep is going to affect your glucose values the next day. So that's really something you have to take into account. If you know it was a bad night of sleep, be extra careful about diet the next day. Yeah. Some people maybe are not going to be able to improve their sleep anytime soon. Let's say you have a newborn, a new child in the house, you might not be sleeping very well for a while. And that might mean you really have to adjust your diet to compensate. So you don't have a lot of control over the sleep issue, but you have control over the diet issue. And there's different levers we have to pull depending on the circumstance. So it's super important to take all of those factors into account, just like you said.
And it's different when you can see your hangovers and the after effect. Even, it helped me realize that once I started realizing what sugar did to me, I started making parallels to alcohol. And if you eat a lot of sugar late at night, the effect on your blood sugar the next day and for that night of sleep is kind of similar in the sense that it's just messed up. It's elevated, it's spiking, it's dropping, it's messed up. And it helps you realize why the next day you're kind of stealing time or stealing energy from the next day when you do have that like ice cream at night, that big piece of pie before you go to sleep, or that booze. Mm-hmm. I also noticed a giant difference between 1 or 2 drinks of alcohol and 4 to 6 or 8 or whatever. Massive difference for the next few days on my glucose levels.
Yeah, and this is something we see in almost everybody, is that those later night meals, especially carbohydrate-rich meals. So ice cream at midnight, cookies at 11 p.m. are going to have a very big impact on your sleep, but also those glucose values all night long. So we actually have a circadian rhythm to our insulin sensitivity, just like other hormones like melatonin. And our insulin sensitivity is lowest in the middle of the night. That is not when our body is primed to be metabolizing food. Right. It wants to be doing some other activities. So we see this, even a healthier, higher carbohydrate meal, if it's consumed later at night, you're going to have a much higher and longer prolonged glucose response than if you ate that same meal during the daytime hours. So a lot of people will realize with their data that got to try to stop eating those meals right before bed and push that last meal a little bit earlier, especially sweets, carbohydrates. And that's going to improve your numbers and also improve your sleep. And it's the same thing with alcohol. A lot of people are also wearing an Oura ring or a Whoop band while they're using the CGM, and you can compare that data and it becomes even more clear. You have two pieces of data now telling you the same thing, that those late night meals and the alcohol later at night are both having a big impact on your sleep and your values the next day. Essentially, our body isn't going to be able to do both things well. It's not going to be able to metabolize food well and help you sleep well. Same with alcohol. Alcohol is a toxin in our system. And so the body's going to prioritize taking care of getting alcohol out of the system and deprioritize other things it needs to be doing normally at 2 a.m. So this becomes pretty clear with the data. And we know that usually, but it becomes much more motivating to make behavior change when you see it. And I think that's one of the most powerful tools about any type of feedback wearable, not just the CGM, but also things like the Oura Ring or the Whoop band or, whatever tracker you have that's giving you 24/7 data. That's really, really motivating for a lot of people to see that either instant gratification or instant consequence to help drive your decision-making in the future. Normally we do something and we don't really see the reward or the consequence for a while. There's a big time gap between the behavior and the outcome, especially like, going to the gym every day, you don't necessarily see a positive outcome for a while. It takes a little while, which makes it not very sticky for some people. But if you work out and you see, wow, my glucose values are 10% better today, that's an immediate trigger, and that helps you stick to that habit every day, which is the best part in my view about the CGM, is just creating sticky habits that last, because we all know at the end of the day, consistency is what wins.
Yeah. And also when you can correlate or align some of this data with the different tracking devices, like I use HRV with the Oura Ring. I've been using that a few years, and some other devices and things like that. And you just cannot hide from it. When you've had a bad experience or a bad night asleep and the AI is nagging at you the next day or whatever, it's kind of a built-in AI accountability partner, which is a little dystopian and creepy and frustrates me sometimes, to be perfectly honest. If you go too deep into just the data, it's not going to be useful. You have to put it into action. And so for me, seeing those examples of the effects on my blood glucose the next day and HRV data, body temperature, respiratory rate, sleep quality, and all these different things, it's really helped me have more fun, but moderate more, if that makes sense, right? Where it's like, now it's cool to have carbs here, to have a little bit of booze here, but not 8 over the course of the night, because I know that will raise my resting heart rate from 38 up to almost 50 overnight, and it will totally jack up my cortisol and then my blood sugar the next day, which will mess up my cravings, make it harder to stay on point. And so a lot of people, I think, are in a bad situation. They're like, I'm doing everything right. I'm eating right. I'm exercising, because they're doing it after they're still kind of in the hangover from these bad decisions or not moderating in the past, but they can't correlate the way that they're feeling a few days later to the bad night's sleep they had that weekend, 3 days before or whatever, to that night when they just stayed up until 2 a.m. and boozed a bunch, or, the baby was sick and they, so when you can actually draw these lines together, I think it can help you use this to modify your behavior. And that's what really matters. It's not the data collection once more, it's modifying your own behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. The first step is having the right information, but that's only, 10, 20% of the equation. And then it's what do you do with that? And can you stick to that? Are you consistent with that? So the behavior change is the most important factor at the end of the day. And just like you said, I think a lot of people have enhanced mind body connection when they see that data with how they feel. You felt kind of cruddy, but just like you're saying, it's hard to pinpoint to what exactly. And then you start to see the data over and over, and then you're like, oh, it's this factor, it's the alcohol, or it's the lack of sleep where I'm feeling like this the next day. And then you start to feel it better in the moment. So it enhances your ability to actually feel those signals and know what's going on, which of course can also help drive behavior change. So I think that data is really, really helpful in putting it all together, allowing you to make informed decisions about your body is essentially how I put it. Sometimes I'm going to do things that I know are going to give me a bad glucose response. I know it's going to affect my HRV, but I'm making informed decisions. I'm being mindful that I know the trade-offs and I'm choosing that way anyway, but then I'm going to balance it overall because I have the right information. And I think that that's what's most important at the end of the day. We don't have to be perfect all the time, but we should know where the trade-offs are and be mindful about the decisions we're making.
Yeah. What about stress? Because a lot of people like to skip this one over. It's easier to quantify sleep and nutrition and movement, meditation, and all these other things. But what about stress? Because it does have a monumental effect on all of this.
It does. And people do want to brush it off all the time. So stress and glucose, again, are going to be very, very related. So we have both acute stressors and then chronic stressors. But any type of stress is going to stimulate hormones like cortisol and adrenaline that essentially tell the body we need energy and we need it right now, and prioritize creating energy because we're in a stress situation. So that means we're going to release glucose stores. We're going to create new glucose to deal with this stressor. And that's just our body's natural stress response. And so whether that's acutely, you're in an argument with someone, something happened, you're going to see a glucose spike in that moment, but it should recover and it should come back down to normal. And that's a healthy, normal, acute stress response. So what our body is not primed to be doing is to be under chronic stress, where we're constantly having a stress response. Our glucose is always elevated and we're always in this fight or flight mode. And so this is what we see often. If somebody has an elevated fasting glucose value and they're eating pretty well, they're exercising pretty regularly, 9 times out of 10, it's most likely that they're under stress. And so they're not even eating, but their body is pumping out glucose to deal with this low level chronic stress. So we're talking about this all the time with people, is trying to identify where these stressors are and helping them make the connection of how this is actually affecting their glucose levels and their body. A lot of people, if they have weight loss goals, but they're under chronic stress 24/7, it is going to hinder your weight loss goals and your weight loss success. So we have to talk about stress, even if people want to push it under the rug. It's the harder thing to address. It's easier to tweak your meals. It's easier to go on a walk, but a lot of people have a harder time addressing stress. But the more we can quantify it with data and you can see what type of effect that's having, I think the easier it is for people to come to the realization that it's actually important and they have to do something about it. And I think the way people deal with stress and help manage it is really personal. Meditation works for some people, not for others. Breathing techniques work for some people, not for others. And it's really trying different things out and figuring out what works for you. But first, you have to come to that realization that stress is actually having an impact on your body.
Have you seen some people come around, make that realization, and then have a good result? Like, what are some examples of the changes that people made to, it's easy to have a blind spot to these stressors that are just upping us. So we're redlining all the time when we don't have to be, but oftentimes we're not aware of them. So I'm curious how people found them and then resolved them.
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever we see those higher fasted glucose values, those average glucose values, we talk about stress. It's one of the first things we bring up. And then that's when we start to try to incorporate different stress management techniques and see how it affects people. And we see this all the time where they're like, well, maybe I am under stress. I never go outside. I work really long hours. A lot of going on with my family. And then we're like, okay, there are definitely chronic stressors in your life. And then we try different techniques. So maybe it's downloading a meditation app and doing that consistently. Maybe it's doing deep breathing throughout the day. Whatever sticks for that person, we'll try to get them to do. And then we will definitely see a lowered fasting glucose value as they take care of that and manage that. But we also see a lot of improvements in people's weight loss goals as soon as they start to actually address and acknowledge stress as something that's going on in their lives. So we see that stress all the time is holding back those weight loss progressions. If your body is constantly making energy and breaking down energy, it's never going to be able to actually break down fat if you always have this glucose you're producing. So it's something we really have to take into account.
But it's interesting because some people seem to they're fueled by that stress state, right? And they use that to kind of keep going. It can be a hard shift, right, for some people?
It can be really difficult. And, at NutriSense, everybody works with a one-on-one dietitian, and we'll talk about these things. But sometimes we have to draw a line where it's like, you really should see someone who can help you work through these different issues. So sometimes it's referring people to other professionals that can help address these stressors. And I think it's helpful for them to recognize that maybe it actually is a bigger issue than they realize. They can see it in the data, they could talk about it with the dietitian, but we can't always fix everyone's stress problems because it is so difficult. Like you're saying, for some people, it is their whole life is a low level chronic stress. And that means changing a lot of things in your life, not just swapping one food ingredient, but changing how you approach your day-to-day routines. So that can be a big overhaul, but that doesn't mean that small things won't make a difference. For some people, that can feel really overwhelming. Just like if you're eating the standard American diet and I'm telling you to change everything, that can feel really overwhelming. So baby steps can help as well. Maybe it's just consistently adding one session of deep breathing each day at the same time each day. And that's 5 minutes of your time possibly. And it's not changing everything, but it's a baby step in the right direction.
And it helps. It sounds so lame and too simple to work, but it definitely does. If you just focus on breathing, even more so than meditation, I think, for most people, because breathing is so there, whereas meditation is super optional for a lot of people. But if you can focus on deep breathing for like a couple minutes a day and do it most days, you're going to be a different person after a few weeks, but you won't notice it right away. And that's the trick with when you're able to measure these different things, you can start to see the progress that would otherwise be invisible to you, and then you can use that as momentum. So that, I think, is a really powerful thing. But I want to make sure that we talk about a few other things that I've seen you bring up, like oat milk is equivalent to soda, it turns out. I recently learned from you.
There are a few people or a few food ingredients that a lot of people have tried that we universally see insane glucose responses to, and oat milk is one of those. I mean,
it makes sense.
It makes sense, but a lot of people are choosing it because they're trying to make a healthier option. They think, and so that's where I get super frustrated with food marketing, because it can be really deceiving and they don't necessarily have your best interest in mind. Maybe they also don't even know what impact it's having. There's possible they've never worn a CGM while they drink their own product. But oat milk is a similar glucose response to like candy or soda. And if you think about it, oats in their whole natural form have more complex starch going on where your body has to break that down and it breaks down slowly. But when we've processed that into a liquid form, you've essentially cleaved all those starch molecules to be individual glucose molecules, just like if you're drinking soda. So it's already digested for you essentially, which means your body doesn't have to do any work, which means it's going to lead to an immediate glucose spike because it's basically just glucose, unfortunately.
What are some other ones that may have surprised you or other people?
Yeah. And I mean, there are some keto brands. I not call out, I guess, specific brands, but if you are keto and you try different keto products, I would recommend testing your glucose levels to see how they actually are. There's a lot of like synthetic fake fibers that say they're 0 grams net carbs, but they're certainly not. Like our body is definitely breaking them down into glucose. So we see this a lot where it says it's keto friendly and then you have a big glucose spike. And people are like, what the heck? I eat this every single day. So just be mindful of if it is a manufactured product, it might not be what it says it is. And just be wary of some of those kind of added fibers. They might not actually be what they say they are.
Yeah, that's so important because now it was easier to count net carbs before the food manufacturers started taking advantage of that. And now they just have, like you said, all these crazy synthetic garbage fibers that, well, they don't know what they do in your body, so they don't count, is essentially how that works now on the nutrition label. So it's totally keto or paleo or vegan or whatever it is. But it does do something in your body, and a lot of those things aren't good. And you might as well just eat the honey, eat the maple sugar. It's real. Yeah. You know what I mean? So if you're going to do it the right way is the way that I feel for the most part. Because even though some ingredients are better than others and some fibers are better than others, there's no free lunch when it comes to all of this. Like there's no way of tricking your body. And that becomes more and more obvious the more that you track in an honest way.
Yeah. Our bodies are smart. And really at the end of the day, if you just want to follow one simple nutrition rule, it's try to eat as close to the whole food as possible. Yeah. Steel cut oats is going to be 100% better than oat milk. Same with, an avocado that has actual 0 net carbs or whatever it is. It's mostly fiber. Is going to be a lot different than the fiber that's created in a lab. Just really try to actually eat foods as close to the natural state as possible. And that's going to take you a long way.
Well, that's a great place to wrap up here today. Cara, what's the best place to find your work as well as CGMs in general and more information there?
Yeah, so our website is NutriSense.io. We're putting out blogs all the time and also putting out tips and tricks on our social media, NutriSense.io. And then if you want to try out a CGM, you're curious of learning more, you can just register on our website. And that's where you get started on actually signing up.
Right on. Cara, this is so much fun. We'll have to have you back again soon for some more experiments.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to hear what else you learn.
Hey, it's Abel one last time, and I just want to say thank you for listening to this episode of Fat Burning Man. Before you go, please smash that like button, hit subscribe, or even leave us a quick review. It helps so much more than you even realize. And if you can think of someone else who you care about, friend, family member, anyone else who might appreciate this free show, then please take a quick second just to share it with them. Word of mouth is really the way that we've grown this show over the years. We have more than, at this point, 4 awards in independent media, 50 million downloads. We couldn't do any of this without you, so we really appreciate it. If you'd like to get in touch with me, then please follow me under Abel James or Fat Burning Man on your social media platform of choice, and I'll do my best to get right back to you. Now, if you want to keep this show coming to you, you can do something really quickly here. My wife Allison and I, along with a very small team, depend on listeners like you to make this show happen week after week. To join our next challenge, coaching group, or get in touch with me one-on-one, visit fatburningman.com. We also make group coaching free with your subscribe and save orders from our family company, Wild Superfoods, which you can find at wildsuperfoods.com. And if you'd like, you can throw a few bucks into the tip jar as a one-time donation or become a contributing member of our group on Patreon. Just look up Abel James on Patreon, and you can join in the fun for as little as a few bucks and get my international best-selling book and audiobook as a special thanks. You can also find that page at fatburningman.com/tipjar. Now, a quick disclaimer for all those legal eagles out there. The Fat Burning Man Show provides general information and discussions about health and related subjects. The information provided in this show or in any related materials are not intended and should not be construed as medical advice, nor is the information a substitute for professional medical expertise, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions and views expressed on this show have no relation to those of any academic, hospital, health practice, or other institution, including corporate overlords. We don't have any of those. If you or any other person has a medical concern, I wholeheartedly encourage you to consult with your healthcare provider. Whew! Okay, don't forget to join our newsletter over at fatburningman.com. When you sign up for our email, I'll even send you a wild quick start guide along with a few of our ridiculously tasty recipes, even Allison's famous chocolate nut cookies, as a special thanks for signing up. This is Abel James signing off. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great week.